If you're anything like me, then you probably enjoy fighting games. My channel really started making strides last year when I covered Mortal Kombat, and now here we are diving deep into Street Fighter. Looking at everything we covered throughout the series so far, we've explored a lot of lore, development history, and behind-the-scenes decisions that went into creating these games. Today, many of these titles are considered classics, or at least cult classics, but during the 90s, Capcom was still trying to answer one major question: how do you properly balance a fighting game? Street Fighter had become incredibly popular, and players were becoming better and more competitive with every release. The problem was that experienced players continued mastering the mechanics, combos, and characters. Newcomers were having a much harder time finding their way into the series. Capcom listened closely to its fans and continued experimenting with ways to make Street Fighter more balanced, accessible, and enjoyable without sacrificing the depth that longtime players loved. In this era, Street Fighter 3 still wasn't ready yet, so Capcom decided to return to the experimental playground of its anime-inspired prequel series. This time, they would take everything they learned from the first Street Fighter Alpha and attempt to improve nearly every part of the experience. Welcome to episode 6 of the Street Fighter Takeover. Today, we're looking at Capcom's evolution with Street Fighter Alpha 2.
Let's get going.
Disgrace to your art.
Show you can!
Are you ready for this? Attention!
Face the might. Worthless.
Imagine this, no gun, no knife. This is what I want, son.
To all my returning viewers, welcome back. I made another one. And to everyone new, welcome to the channel. I am the Retro Phantom, and here on the channel every Saturday I cover the games that made our lives great. Right now, we're working our way through the Street Fighter franchise in preparation for the new movie dropping this year. We still have around 11 videos left to go, so there's plenty more Street Fighter history ahead of us. If you want to be there and join me for the rest of the journey, please hit that subscribe button. We are inching closer and closer to 10,000 subs, and I would love for you to help me make channel history. The best way to support the channel is by liking and hyping the video. It goes a long way towards helping smaller channels like mine grow in the YouTube algorithm. And of course, if you're feeling generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description. With that said, let's dive into this. Before we get into Street Fighter Alpha 2, we need to quickly look back at how we arrived here, because Capcom's journey with this franchise has already been filled with experimentation, unexpected success, and a few strange detours. The original Street Fighter introduced the basic foundation of the series. It gave us Ryu, Ken, Sagat, and special moves. It also had this idea of traveling around the world to face different opponents. However, the game was still rough around the edges. The controls were difficult. The combat system lacked the smoothness the series would later become known for, and Capcom had not yet discovered what would make Street Fighter special. Then came Street Fighter 2010, a futuristic action platformer that had almost nothing to do with the fighting game people remembered. The North American version attempted to connect the game to the original by renaming its protagonist Ken, but it was not a true continuation of Street Fighter. It showed that Capcom still did not fully understand what kind of franchise Street Fighter was supposed to become. Everything changed with Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 2 did not simply improve the original game, it helped revolutionize the entire fighting game genre itself. It introduced a larger cast of playable characters, each with their own abilities, personalities, fighting styles, and reasons for entering the tournament. It helped popularize competitive arcade gaming and gave players a game that was easy to understand but incredibly difficult to master. However, Street Fighter 2's success also created a new problem for Capcom. Instead of immediately moving on to Street Fighter 3, Capcom continued updating Street Fighter 2. Champion Edition allowed players to control the bosses. Hyper Fighting increased the speed. Super Street Fighter 2 introduced new characters, and Super Turbo even added more mechanics, including the Super Combo system. Each update helped refine the game, but after multiple versions, Street Fighter was beginning to feel oversaturated. Capcom needed something that felt fresh without completely abandoning the gameplay that made the franchise so successful in the first place. That need eventually led into Street Fighter Alpha. Street Fighter Alpha, known in Japan as Street Fighter Zero, was not created as Street Fighter 3. Instead, it acted as a new beginning and an experimental testing ground for the future of the series. Rather than continuing the story after Street Fighter 2, Alpha decided to move backwards in the timeline. It took place between the original Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2, allowing Capcom to explore younger versions of established characters such as Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, and Sagat. This gave Capcom an opportunity to expand the history of the franchise. We could now see Ryu continuing his journey after defeating Sagat, Sagat struggling with the humiliation of that loss, Chun-Li beginning her investigation into M. Bison, and Ken balancing his life in America with his desire to continue improving as a fighter. Alpha also connected Street Fighter to Capcom's wider universe by bringing characters from Final Fight, including Guy and Saddam. This helped establish that Final Fight and Street Fighter existed within the same universe, opening the door for more characters and storylines to cross between the two series. Visually, Street Fighter Alpha introduced a completely different presentation. The characters had a more colorful, exaggerated, anime-inspired appearance that separated the game from Street Fighter 2. The animations were smoother, the character portraits were more expressive, and the entire game felt younger and more energetic. But Alpha was important for more than its style. It allowed Capcom to experiment with the new gameplay mechanics without placing the pressure of Street Fighter 3 name on the project. But this new one would be the moment they took the results of that experiment and attempted to create a game that Alpha was always meant to be. Which brings us to today.
Yes. Yes.
Jeffrey, are you okay?
Almost there.
Jeffrey, what are you doing in there?
Nothing.
Open the door this instant.
Yeah.
Jeffrey, my God, you're gonna go blind.
I don't care. I don't care. Ooh. Oh,
New
yeah.
Street Fighter Alpha 2. It's good.
Oh, yeah.
It's really good.
Oh, yeah, baby. Ooh.
While Street Fighter Alpha was viewed by many as a welcome new entry into the franchise, Capcom did not believe the game represented everything the Alpha series could become. Remember, the first game was developed in approximately 6 months, even though the team had originally been given 3-month deadlines. Despite that rushed development period, Alpha became both a critical and commercial success. A sequel was almost inevitable. There was also a much larger reason Capcom needed to keep the series moving, and we'll discuss this in a future video. Street Fighter 3 was experiencing significant development delays. The Alpha series would help fill in the gap between the two numbered entries. Capcom needed to maintain Street Fighter's momentum, especially while competing fighting game franchises were beginning to make waves of their own inside arcades. Once Street Fighter Alpha 2 was greenlit, the development team was thankfully given more time than it had received for the first game. This allowed Capcom to examine work in Alpha, what did not work, and what needed to evolve. One of the major complaints surrounding the first game involved the repetitive gameplay. Some critics and players believed Alpha encouraged what Capcom referred to as one-pattern tactics. Players could jump towards their opponents, perform the same chain combo, and then repeat the sequence over and over and over again. Because the original game's chain combo system, also known as the zero combo system, was relatively easy to use, some people believed it made the combat predictable and occasionally unbalanced. Instead of forcing players to adapt on their opponents, the system could reward them for relying on a single successful routine. Producer Noritaka Funimazu explained the problem. There are players who repeatedly use the same attack sequence over and over, jump in, perform the same chain, then repeat it endlessly. Many people told us that kind of play had become tiresome. We agreed it made the game feel too simple, so from the beginning of Zero 2, we planned to rethink the battle system. For the record, so there is no confusion, Street Fighter Alpha was released in Japan under the name Street Fighter Zero. Whenever the developers refer to 0 or 02, they're talking about the games we know as Street Fighter Alpha and Street Fighter Alpha 2. Now, these complaints may have represented only a smaller portion of Alpha's audience, but Capcom still took them seriously. Competitive play had become one of the defining elements of Street Fighter's success. If the combat felt repetitive or unbalanced, experienced players could eventually lose interest. At the same time, if the game became too demanding, newcomers might struggle to find their way into the franchise. Capcom, therefore, had to find a balance between accessibility and competitive depth. The team's goal was not to abandon Alpha's identity. They wanted to preserve its anime-inspired presentation, younger cast, and place it with the Street Fighter universe timeline. What needed to change was the way players approached the combat in the first place. Rather than rewarding repetition, Capcom wanted Street Fighter Alpha 2 to reward adaptation, creativity, and most importantly, experimentation. Matches needed to feel less like a routine and more like a constantly changing battle between two players. Around this time, Neo-G and Katsuyuki Kentaka were relatively new members of Capcom's development staff. Despite their limited experience with the company, they were selected to work as planners on the project alongside Funimazu. Their most important responsibility would be helping redesign the combo system. Because the team had more development time than it received in the first Alpha, it was able to reconsider some of the game's central mechanics. However, this did not mean the developers had unlimited time. Alpha 2 was still being produced under a demanding schedule, and any major change to the battle system would create additional work throughout the entire game. Neo-G and Kentaka spent several months refining a proposal for a completely new mechanic. When the idea was first presented, Funimazu was skeptical. He understood the problems with the original Alpha, but he was also concerned that such an ambitious system could not be completed before the deadline. Funimazu would explain. The biggest goal was creating what would become the original combo system. We wanted to introduce a mechanic that would completely change how everyone played. The proposal was not simply another adjustment to the existing chain combo system. It would require Capcom to remove one of the demanding mechanics of the first game and replace it with something that gave players far more freedom. As Funimazu continued, "At first, I warned them that even if the idea was good, the schedule was already tight and there might not be enough time to finish it properly, but they kept improving the proposal. Eventually, it became clear that implementing original combos would nearly double the workload. The reason for that increased workload was simple. Changing the combo system affected almost everything else. Every character's normal attack, special moves, speed, damage, and animation timing had to be tested around the new mechanic. The team could not simply copy the original Alpha's parameters and expect the game to remain balanced. Once Funimazu saw the completed proposal, however, the direction of the sequel became clear. The old chain combo system had to go. In its place would be the original combo system known as custom combos outside Japan. Instead of following a predetermined sequence of light, medium, and heavy attacks, players would activate the mechanic and temporarily gain the freedom to create their own combinations. Normal attacks and special moves could be linked together in ways that were normally impossible, allowing players to develop sequences based on their character positioning and personal creativity. The system directly addressed Capcom's concerns with the first game. A player could no longer depend entirely on one built-in chain combo to get the most out of an original combo. They will have to experiment, practice, and discover which attacks work together. Two players using the same character could potentially create different combinations. It was exactly the kind of mechanic that could change how people approach the game. However, implementing this came at a cost. Funimazu admitted that the team had to make compromises to finish Alpha 2 on schedule. Several planned features were cut, and the developers were forced to focus their resources on completing and balancing the central battle system. Even with those sacrifices, everyone involved worked hard enough to finish the game on time. The first Alpha had been an experiment, a new art style, a new timeline, and a new foundation for the franchise. But Alpha 2, Capcom was no longer simply experimenting. The company was taking everything it had learned from the first game and attempting to transform Alpha into the deeper, more balanced, and more complete fighting game they had always envisioned. And on March 25th, 1996, we will finally see Capcom's evolution. The entire development of Alpha 2 revolved around one central goal: finding a better balance. Of course, this was not a new struggle for Capcom. There's a reason Street Fighter 2 received so many different revisions. Every time players discovered dominant characters, repetitive strategies, or mechanics that could be exploited, Capcom returned to the game and attempted to refine the experience. Instead of releasing another minor update to the first Alpha, Capcom used Alpha 2 as an opportunity to reconsider how the game was played at its core. The first Alpha introduced several mechanics that separated it from Street Fighter 2. Air blocking, alpha counters, multiple levels of super combos, and a universal chain combo system. Those additions made the game faster, more accessible, but it also created a problem. The first Alpha, most characters could connect their normal attacks by pressing buttons in a general order from weaker attacks to stronger ones. For example, a player could begin with a light attack, continue into a medium attack, and finish with a heavy attack without needing the precise timing normally associated with Street Fighter combos. This made it easier for newcomers to produce exciting combinations, but it also encouraged some players to rely on the same sequence repeatedly, rather than studying an opponent, adapting their approach, or learning character-specific combinations. They could jump towards someone, perform a familiar chain combo, and then attempt the same pattern repetitively. Alpha 2 almost completely removed that universal system. Outside of specific character abilities and predetermined sequences, players could no longer casually chain most normal attacks together by simply pressing the buttons in ascending order. Standard combos once again depended on more heavily linked cancels and accurate timing. Contemporary guides describe Alpha 2's combinations as returning to a more traditional Street Fighter 2 style structure. This immediately changed the pace of combat. Normal attacks now required more consideration. Players had to think about their positioning, the range of each attack, and how much time they would need to recover afterward. You could not always begin pressing buttons and expect a full sequence to come out. Your attacks had to be chosen with a purpose. However, Capcom did not remove chain combos without providing something new in their place. The defining addition to Street Fighter Alpha 2 was the custom combo system, known as the original combo system in Japan. Once a player had at least one level of super meter, they could activate a custom combo by simultaneously pressing 2 punch buttons and 1 kick button, or 2 kick buttons and 1 punch button. The character would briefly flash before moving with a trail of shadows behind them, while a separate timer appeared on the above super meter. For as long as that timer remained active, the player could rapidly combine normal and special attacks in sequences that would not usually be possible. Recovery between attacks was reduced, moves could be performed more quickly, and opponents could be juggled through creative combinations. The amount of super meters spent determined how long the custom combo lasted. Activating it at one level gave the player a limited window, while committing all 3 levels provided more time to build a longer and potentially more damaging sequence. Unlike the first game, universal chain combos did not automatically decide the sequence for you. You as a player had to create it. You needed to understand which attacks work together, where the opponent would be positioned after each hit, and how to use your limited activation time efficiently. Super combos were unavailable during a custom combo, meaning players had to construct their sequences from normal and special moves instead. This was Capcom's answer to the one pattern players. In the original game, players had almost an easy path from light to heavy, but this game gave players a temporary window of freedom and challenged them to discover what they could accomplish with it. At lower levels, custom combos were flashy and enjoyable to experiment with. At higher levels, they would become extremely damaging tools built around careful positioning, practice inputs, and deep understanding of the character. Capcom also refined the defensive side of the game. Alpha counters returned, allowing players to spend 1 level super meter to interrupt pressure after blocking an attack. Where fighters in the first Alpha generally had only 1 assigned Alpha counter, every character in Alpha 2 was given 2. one performed with a punch and another one performed with a kick. These counters commonly serve different defensive purposes. Depending on the fighter, one might be more useful against standing or airborne pressure, while the other could better respond to lower attacks. This gave the entire roster more options when dealing with an aggressive opponent. That also made the super meter more strategically important. The same 3-level gauge power super combos, custom combos, and alpha counters returned. You could spend one level to escape pressure, use one or more levels to activate a custom combo, or preserve the meter for a powerful super combo. Every decision carried an opportunity cost. Do you sacrifice your meter to stop your opponent's offense? Do you save it for a level 3 super combo and get a super finish? Do you activate a custom combo and trust yourself to create something even more damaging? That decision making is where Alpha 2 begins to separate itself from the first game. It did not completely abandon accessibility, nor did it remove every mechanic established by Alpha. Air blocking, super combos, recovery rolls, throws, taunts, it all returned here. What Capcom changed was the philosophy behind the combat. The result is a game that feels more deliberate, more strategic, and far more complete. But before we can juggle how well all these mechanics came together, we first need to look at what the game actually offers, from its modes and settings to its expanded roster of World Warriors. For this video, I used the PlayStation 1 version of Alpha 2. There are several other ways to experience the game, but we will cover those versions later when we get to the port section of the video. On the PlayStation, we have the same basic selection modes we have seen throughout this series so far. Arcade is the main attraction, allowing you to select a character, fight through a series of opponents, and eventually reach their ending. Versus mode is available for local multiplayer, while training mode gives players a place to practice their special moves, combos, and newly introduced custom combo sequences. For beginners, the difficulty can once again be adjusted across 8 different levels. At this point, this has become a common feature throughout the Street Fighter games that we've covered so far. However, there was one small change that I noticed. For the first time in the series, at least from what I noticed during its playthrough, the game does not punish or insult you for lowering the difficulty. In some of the earlier games, completing the arcade mode on the easier setting will result in a message telling you to increase the difficulty next time. In Alpha 2, you can still watch your character's complete ending regardless of the difficulty you select. That may seem like a small detail, but it supports the larger goal Capcom had for this game. Alpha 2 was supposed to offer a balanced experience for different types of players. Newcomers could lower the difficulty, learn the mechanics, and still experience the story, while experienced players could increase the challenge and test themselves against more aggressive opponents. Outside of the combo system, the basic gameplay will feel familiar to anyone who played the first Alpha. Manual and auto modes were both returned. In manual mode, the players are responsible for everything. You must block attacks yourself, correctly input your special moves, and perform the full commands required for super combos. In exchange, your super combo gauge can build through all 3 levels, giving you access to the strongest supers and longer custom combo activations. Then you have auto mode, which is a beginner-friendly experience. The game can automatically block certain incoming attacks, and super combos can be performed with simplified inputs. The trade-off is that your super combo gauge is maxed out at level 1, limiting the strength of your supers and the amount of time available for custom combos. These are the same things we saw established in the first Alpha game. So this creates another balance between accessibility and control. You also have turbo mode, which can be turned on or off, allowing you to adjust the speed of matches. Much like the modes and settings, many of the options introduced in the first Alpha returned in this sequel. But when discussing any Street Fighter game, the most important part of the experience is always the roster. Alpha 2 features Adon, Akuma, Birdie, Charlie, Chun-Li, Dasim, Dan, Gin, Guy, Kin, Bison, Relento, Rose, Ryu, Sagat, Sakura, Saddam, and Zangief. This roster brings together characters from nearly every part of Capcom's fighting game history. Some fighters return from the original Street Fighter, other icons return from Street Fighter 2, several originated from Final Fight, while characters such as Charlie, Rose, and Dan were introduced in the first Alpha make a return. Then we have Sakura, one of the major new additions to Alpha 2. Playing the game is one thing. Trying to understand the story is completely different. I looked through the game, watched the endings, and checked the instruction manual. However, when I compared the information with online summaries of the story, I began questioning where some of those additional details were coming from. My first instinct is to always cross-reference information before placing it into a video. Being honest, I initially had a difficult time finding the original source. The game gives us endings, but it does not provide the complete build-up behind each character's journey. The PlayStation Manual does not contain every detail either, and other versions of the game do not suddenly provide a full story mode explaining everything. Eventually, I located character biographies that contain much more background information, but they were written entirely in Japanese. And as everyone watching this channel has probably figured out by now, I speak considerably more English than Japanese. After translating what I could, I discovered that much of this information came from a Japanese publication called All About Street Fighter 02. Remember, Alpha 2 was released in Japan as 02. I eventually found a PDF copy of the publication and translated the relevant character profiles as carefully as possible. Those biographies provided the context and build-up of the game itself largely left out. So, before we move to the individual character stories, I want to make it clear where this information is coming from. The endings in the game will remain our primary source. However, when additional context is needed, I will also reference the translated biographies from All About Street Fighter 02. And this is what I can gather from the story. Immediately following the events of Alpha, Ryu returns to the training grounds of his childhood in Japan. Still troubled by the dark energy he felt growing inside him, Ryu hopes to seek guidance from his master, Goken. However, when he arrives, he finds the dojo completely destroyed. Goken has been brutally murdered by an overwhelmingly powerful warrior. Consumed by shock and grief, Ryu begins following rumors of a demonic fighter traveling across the world. His search eventually reveals the identity of Goken's killer. Akuma, Goken's estranged brother and a warrior who was completely surrendered himself to the murderous power known as the Satsui no Hado. I find it kind of funny here that Street Fighter the movie, Akuma's ending in the arcade also referenced that Goken was his brother, but now this is actually becoming canon here in Alpha. But let's continue. As Ryu continues his journey, he is approached by a Japanese high school student named Sakura. Sakura has become fascinated by Ryu after witnessing his fighting ability and has even begun imitating his techniques. When she finally tracks him down, she eagerly asks Ryu to become her teacher. However, Ryu refuses. He understands that he is still struggling to control the darkness inside him, and he does not believe he is stable or experienced enough to guide someone else. Even so, Sakura continues following his journey, hoping to prove that she is worthy of becoming his student. Ryu eventually located by Ken, who immediately recognizes that something is wrong with his best friend. Ryu's grief, anger, and obsession finding Akuma are causing him to lose focus. More importantly, Ken can sense that Ryu is beginning to drift closer towards the Satsui no Hado. The two friends spar, but Ryu is distracted and emotionally unstable. Ken manages to defeat him, and in an attempt to help Ryu regain his focus, gives him his hair ribbon. Ken ties the ribbon around Ryu's head as a reminder of their friendship, of the fighter Ryu was truly wants to become. During his travels, Ryu crosses paths with Gen, an elderly martial artist and legendary assassin. Despite his age and failing health, Gen immediately recognizes the deadly energy developing inside Ryu. Their brief but intense battle serves as a warning. Gen represents what can happen when a person spends their entire life surrounded by violence and death. For Ryu, the encounter becomes another reminder that power without control can eventually consume the person who possesses it. Ryu's journey finally leads him to the island of Gokentu, where Akuma is waiting. The two warriors clash in an explosive battle, but Akuma is not simply trying to defeat Ryu. He is testing him. Akuma recognizes that Ryu possesses the same murderous potential that transformed him into the warrior he is today. Throughout the battle, Akuma deliberately pushes Ryu towards anger, grief, and desperation, attempting to force him to fully embrace the Satsui no Hado. For a moment, it works. Ryu begins to surrender himself to the darkness, revealing the terrifying power hidden inside him. However, after recognizing what he's becoming, Ryu fights back against the energy and forcefully suppresses it. He refuses to follow Akuma's path. Akuma is amused by Ryu's resistance, but he's also disappointed that Ryu refuses to embrace his true potential. Rather than continuing the battle, Akuma strikes the ground with an overwhelming force and shatters the entire island beneath them. As the island collapses into the ocean, Ryu is forced to escape the sinking ruins. He leaves the island, understanding that Akuma is not his only enemy. His greatest battle will not be against Sagat and Bison, or even the forces of Shadulo. It will be against the darkness growing inside his own soul. Now I'm going to be covering the rest of the characters in the game, except for Ryu, since we just covered his story based on the overall game's lore. I will be using their bios from the magazine I found to speak on their characters, starting with Adon. So just like Alpha, we see who their main challenger is based on the arcade mode. For Adon, it's Sagat, who we saw he had a rivalry with in the first game. Based on his bio, we learn that he grew up hearing stories about Sagat, the legendary emperor of Muay Thai. Those stories inspired Adon to dedicate his life to the fighting style, but admiration eventually turned into arrogance. Adon did not simply want to become as powerful as Sagat. He wanted to prove that Sagat's version of Muay Thai was outdated and that he had discovered the style's true essence. He trained relentlessly for the opportunity to challenge his former master. However, when the battle finally arrived, Adon realized Sagat was far more skilled than he had originally believed. Instead of humbling him, that realization only strengthened his obsession. Adon developed the Jaguar varied assault by combining his own techniques with what he learned from Sagat. In his mind, defeating him would not just make him a better fighter, but it would make him the new emperor of Muay Thai. This continues from what we saw from Adon in the first alpha. His entire identity is built around surpassing Sagat, while Sagat is attempting to grow beyond his defeat against Ryu. Adon is moving in the opposite direction. He's becoming increasingly consumed by pride, resentment, and the need to prove himself. In his ending, Adon finally defeats Sagat and declares that his former master's Muay Thai is old and useless. He walks away believing he has replaced the old emperor and created a new form of the fighting style. However, only months later, Adon's students receive some disturbing news. Their master has been apparently defeated and possibly killed by a mysterious warrior with dark skin and red hair. Based on that description, the attacker is clearly meant to be Akuma. Whether this ending represents the official timeline, no, I won't know until the next game, but it does deliver an important warning about Adon's character. He spends the entire game believing that defeating Sagat will make him the strongest Muay Thai fighter alive, only to encounter a level of power far beyond anything he was prepared to face. And now we're going to talk about Akuma. And I want to say that there are two versions of Akuma. You have regular Akuma and you have Shin Akuma. Now, Shin Akuma kind of operates as that boss swap you would get at the end of the game, as you've seen in previous Street Fighters. So there are certain requirements that have to be met in order to fight him. If you wanted to fight Shin Akuma, you needed to have no lost rounds, meaning you have to win every single round cleanly on any difficulty. You need 3 perfects, where you finish a minimum of 3 rounds without taking any damage. You need 5 super or custom finishes, where you end at least 5 rounds using a super combo or custom combo. But the most important one is, if you're player 1, you must pick an alternate punch color, and if you're player 2, you must pick an alternate kick color. So I just wanted to make sure I cleared that up before we start talking about Akuma. Now let's actually look into his character. And me looking into this magazine gives me the first time I can truthfully look into his story. And for the record, his biography refers to him as Goki, which is his name in Japan. Since most of us in the United States know him as Akuma, that will be the name I will be using throughout the video. Based on his biography, Akuma trained under Master Gotetsu, the same martial arts master who trained Goken. During this time, Akuma dedicated himself to mastering the forbidden technique known as the Shun Goku Satsu, or the Raging Demon. To control this technique, Akuma embraced the Satsui no Hado, the murderous intent that allows a fighter to sacrifice everything, including their own humanity, in exchange for overwhelming power. Unlike Ryu, who struggles to suppress his darkness, Akuma willingly accepts it. He abandons his emotional attachments, isolates himself from others, and begins walking where he believes is the path towards martial arts perfection. His only true desire is to become stronger than everyone else. To test whether he had truly mastered this forbidden technique, Akuma challenged his own master, Gotetsu, to a battle to the death. Although Akuma defeated and killed him, the fight did not satisfy him. Instead of believing he had reached perfection, Akuma concluded that he was still inadequate and needed to continue pushing himself further. That tells us almost everything we need to understand about his character. Akuma does not fight for money, revenge, fame, or even control. He fights because defeating powerful opponents is the only way he believes he can continue evolving. Every victory simply convinces him that an even stronger opponent must exist somewhere in the world. In his arcade mode, Akuma's main challenger is Gin. This is important because Gin is one of the few fighters who understands the same murderous power Akuma has embraced. Gin is also a legendary assassin who is searching for a worthy opponent capable of giving him an honorable death. Their battle is therefore more than a normal rivalry. It's a confrontation between 2 aging masters who have dedicated their lives to violence but arrive at very different conclusions about what their life means. After Akuma defeats Gin, Gin admits that he has lost and prepares to accept death. Akuma moves closer, seemingly ready to finish him, but suddenly disappears. Gin realizes that Akuma understood something during their encounter and chose not to kill him. Akuma later stands alone beneath the moon, reflecting on the powerful opponents who have challenged him. He thinks about fighters such as Bison, Ryu, and Gin, and begins to reconsider his belief that the world has become weak. However, he does not view this as an opportunity for friendship or redemption. He sees it as proof that there is still worthy warriors left for him to destroy. Akuma ends the game accepting that one day he may finally encounter an opponent capable of killing him. Until then, he will continue walking his solitary path towards what he considers perfection. Now let's move on to Birdie, another Street Fighter 1 OG. Based on his bio, Birdie has already built a reputation as one of the most dangerous brawlers in the criminal underworld. He worked as an enforcer and a debt collector, using his overwhelming strength to punish anyone who failed to pay what they owed. Unlike many of the martial artists in the series, Birdie is not someone who spent years mastering a disciplined fighting style. He is described as a natural brawler who relies on instinct, aggression, and raw power. That fits perfectly with how he carries himself. Birdie believes strength is all that matters. He enjoys intimidating people, destroying challengers, and proving that no one around him can match his physical power. Just like the first Street Fighter Alpha, Birdie's final opponent is once again in Bison. That rivalry makes sense because Birdie's entire story revolves around his desire to join the Shadulo. He does not care about Bison's larger plans or the organization's criminal activities. He simply sees the Shadulo as an opportunity to gain money, influence, and power. After Birdie defeats Bison, he demands to be recognized as the strongest. Bison acknowledges his strength and accepts him as a member of Shadulo, promising that Birdie can achieve anything he desires with the organization's support. At first, Birdie believes he has finally found the perfect position. But once he gains access to the command center, he secretly enters the data room and begins searching through the organization's files. Birdie discovers that Bison has a hidden agenda and quickly realizes that he may be nothing more than another tool. This is where Birdie shows that he's not completely foolish. He may be motivated by greed and power, but he understands when someone's trying to exploit him. Instead of remaining loyal to Bison, Birdie decides to leave Shadulo before the organization can use him for their plans. So while his rivalry with Bison continues from the first game, the ending gives Birdie a little more independence. He wants the benefits of joining a powerful criminal organization, but he refuses to become anyone's pawn. Birdie may be arrogant, violent, and selfish, but even he knows better than to completely trust in Bison. Now let's talk about Chun-Li. At this point in the series, her entire journey is still driven by the death of her father and her determination to uncover the truth behind it. Based on her biography, Chun-Li began studying Chinese martial arts at a very young age. Her father was both her greatest inspiration and the person who first introduced her to the deeper meaning behind martial arts. As she continued training, Chun-Li traveled in search of new techniques and eventually developed the powerful kicking style that would become her signature. She earned a reputation as one of the strongest women in the world, but none of those accomplishments filled the emptiness left behind her father's disappearance and death. For Chun-Li, becoming stronger was never just about proving herself. She believed mastering her father's teachings would eventually give her the strength needed to find his killer and bring down the organization responsible. That search once again leads her directly to M. Bison. Just like in the first Alpha, Bison is Chun-Li's final opponent because he represents the answer she has been searching for. He's not simply another powerful fighter standing in her way. He is the leader of Shadulo and the man connected to her father's death. After Chun-Li defeats him, Bison admits that she surprised him. However, before she can capture him or force him to reveal more information, he escapes aboard one of Shadulo's aircrafts. Before leaving, Bison taunts her by saying they will meet again and cruelly jokes that he hopes she amuses him more than her father did. That statement finally gives Chun-Li the confirmation she needed. Bison killed her father. Although she's found the man responsible, she is still denied justice. Bison disappears back into the criminal underworld, leaving Chun-Li with more determination than ever to continue pursuing him. After a few days, Chun-Li is appointed as special investigator assigned to Shadulo. Instead of allowing grief to consume her, she turns it into a mission. Her story continues, establishing Chun-Li as more than someone seeking revenge. She wants answers, accountability, and justice for every person harmed by Bison's organization. Now we get to our favorite joke character, Dan. Even though Dan is mainly played for comedy, his story is still a bit around something serious, avenging his father's death. From his bio, we learn that Dan's father, Go Hibiki, was a martial artist who challenged Sagat and managed to take one of his eyes during their battle. Sagat ultimately killed him, leaving Dan obsessed with revenge. Dan trained under Goken, but once Goken realized that revenge was driving him, he refused to continue teaching him. Dan eventually created his own fighting style, combining what he learned with his own exaggerated personality. In Alpha 2, Sagat is once again Dan's final opponent because he's the man Dan spent years preparing to face. Dan does not enter this fight for fame or money. He believes defeating Sagat will finally avenge his father and prove that his training was worth it. After winning, Dan celebrates as if he's become the strongest fighter alive. He declares that his father has finally been avenged and returns to Hong Kong, where he hopes to open a dojo to teach his fighting style to the world. But this is where the joke around Dan continues. He has the confidence of a legendary master, but the students inside his dojo are struggling. Instead of questioning his teachings, Dan blames them for lacking focus while continuing to chase worldwide fame. Still, beneath all that comedy, this ending gives Dan a form of closure. His entire journey in the Alpha series has been centered on Sagat, and this ending, he finally achieves the victory he believes his father deserved. The problem is, defeating Sagat does not suddenly make Dan the perfect warrior he imagines himself to be. His revenge may be complete, but his ego has only gotten stronger. Now we turn to the Yoga Master himself, Dasim, a Street Fighter 2 OG. Since this is the first time we've seen him since Street Fighter 2, Alpha 2 gives us a much deeper look into who he is and why he fights. Based on his bio, Dasim left his village and spent months traveling through communities suffering from illnesses. He used his knowledge to heal as many people as he could, but he quickly realized that some diseases could not be cured with spiritual guidance alone. The villagers needed medicine, food, and better treatment. That is what eventually pushed Dasim into fighting. He did not enter the tournament for fame, pride, or personal glory. He fought to raise money for the people depending on him. This separates him from almost everyone else in the roster. While many characters are chasing revenge, strength, or recognition, Dasim is fighting entirely for others. Even when he uses violent techniques, his purpose is still rooted in compassion. His bio also shows that he struggled with the morality of fighting. Dasim had devoted himself to peace, but he was now using his body and his yoga abilities to hurt people. He had to convince himself that violence could be justified if it was used to reduce a greater amount of suffering. That conflict continues into his final battle with Bison. Bison represents almost everything Dasim stands against. Dasim uses his power to protect people, while Bison uses his power to control and destroy people. Defeating Bison is therefore not just another tournament victory. It is Dasim confronting a source of suffering that threatens far more than his own village. After defeating him, Dasim returns home and enters deep meditation. He begins questioning whether the violence he committed has corrupted his spirit, asking what good possibly comes from the damage he caused. The people from the village remind him what his victories accomplished. Because of him, they now have medicine, food, and shelter. Dasim's wife tells him that he has not created bad karma. In her eyes, he made life better for everyone around him. Still, Dasim is not completely comfortable with what he has done. His ending leaves him asking one important question. Does the end justify the means? Now we look at someone we have not seen since the original Street Fighter, Gin. In that game, he appeared as one of the opponents Ryu or Ken could face, but he was not playable. With Alpha 2, we can finally control him and learn more about his history. Based on his bio, Gin is one of the most feared assassins in Hong Kong's underworld. He was born into a long line of martial artists and spent his life mastering techniques designed to kill opponents with a single strike. His most famous technique was known as the Death Touch. Gin is not entering this tournament for fight money, fame, or revenge. After a lifetime of defeating and killing others, he is searching for a truly powerful warrior, someone capable of challenging him and possibly giving him the death he believes a martial artist like him deserves. That search leads him to Akuma. Akuma is Gin's final opponent because the two men share a similar relationship with death. Both had dedicated their lives to perfecting lethal martial arts, and neither fears dying in battle. However, there's one important difference between these two. Akuma continues fighting because he wants to surpass every powerful warrior he encounters. Gin, on the other hand, understands that his remaining time is limited. He's not only looking for victory, he's searching for a final battle worthy of ending his life. After Gin defeats Akuma, he demands that Akuma finish him, but Akuma refuses. Rather than killing a weakened opponent, Akuma disappears and leaves Gin behind. Gin realized that Akuma understood his condition and chose not to grant him the death he wanted. This victory therefore feels more like a loss. Gin defeated one of the strongest fighters alive, but by doing so, he may have lost his greatest opportunity to die in combat. He continues his journey. His health begins failing him, yet he remains determined to keep fighting until the end. Now we look at my guy, Guy. If you recall from the first Alpha, Guy originally came from the Final Fight series. I've never played Final Fight before, so much like learning the lore of Street Fighter, I'm also beginning to tap into the history surrounding that franchise as well. But based on his bio, Guy is the 38th successor of the Bushin Ryu, a traditional form of ninjutsu that has been passed down through generations. Unlike many fighters from this game, Guy is not motivated by revenge, money, or fame. His journey is about testing the limits of his training and determining whether he is truly worthy of carrying that name. Guy understands the techniques that his master taught him, but he does not want to simply copy the fighters who came before him. He wants to develop his own interpretation of the style and push Bushin Ryu beyond its established limits. Just like the first Alpha, Guy's final opponent is once again Bison. Bison represents the opposite of Guy's philosophy. Guy believes true strength comes from discipline, control, and constant personal development. Bison gains power through domination, corruption, and the exploitation of others. After defeating Bison, Guy believes he has finally discovered the inner secret of his martial art. He has taken the foundation of the old Bushin style and breathed new life into it through his own determination. Guy then returns to his master, who warns him not to become too impressed by titles or labels. Bushin Ryu is only a name, and becoming a true master requires more than inheriting another person's techniques. A fighting style is not simply handed down, it must continue to evolve. Guy remembers his master teaching him that he must overcome everything before he can truly call himself a master. The two then face each other in a serious battle between teacher and student. There's no hatred between them. It's simply one martial artist testing another and determining whether Guy is finally prepared to take the next step. Now let's talk about another Street Fighter OG, Ken. Based on his bio, Ken has continued building a reputation as one of the strongest competitors in the fighting world. He enters tournaments with confidence, determined to prove that every victory comes from giving everything he has rather than relying on luck or cheap tactics. But despite all the opponents standing in front of him, he still has one fighter that he truly wants to face, Ryu. Their rivalry has existed since they trained together under Goken, but it has never been driven by hatred or malice. Ken and Ryu fight because they respect one another, and each man uses the other as a measuring stick for his own growth. That's why Ryu is Ken's final opponent. When Ken defeats him, he immediately notices something is wrong. Ryu's mind is still trapped in his previous battle with Sagat, and he's allowing that experience to interfere with the fight in front of him. Ken tells him to stay focused and remember that what matters is not the previous battle, it's the opponent standing in front of him right now. He then gives Ryu his red hair ribbon, telling him to keep it as a reminder of both Ken and their fight. This is an important moment in the series because it explains how Ryu receives the red headband, and that would eventually become one of the most recognizable parts of his appearance. The two friends then separate and continue following their own paths, promising that they will meet and fight again. When Ken returns home, he admits to Eliza that Ryu was stronger than he expected. Rather than becoming discouraged, Ken uses the experience as motivation to train harder so that he will be ready for their next battle. This is what defines the rivalry. Neither man needs the other to fail. They both want the other to become stronger because it gives them another reason to continue improving. Now we look into one of the more interesting stories, Charlie. If you recall, his death was the one reason for Guile's feud with Bison in Street Fighter 2. The last time we saw Charlie in the Alpha series, his conflict with Bison had already felt personal. He had gone after Shadulo, and the ending strongly implied tragedy. We saw Charlie struck down, and all that was left behind were his dog tags as Bison walked away. Based on his bio, Charlie is a military man who became obsessed with exposing and destroying Shadulo after witnessing just how dangerous the organization really was. He learned about their use of psychic power and their ruthless methods and how far their influence had spread. Instead of backing away, Charlie kept pushing forward, even if it meant going in alone. That is why, once again, his final fight is with Bison. Just like Chun-Li, Charlie is looking for answers, but unlike Chun-Li, Charlie approaches the situation like a soldier trying to tear apart a conspiracy from the inside. After he defeats Bison, he immediately starts demanding the truth. He wants to know Bison's connection to the military and who's been helping him. And that is where Charlie's story takes an even darker turn. Before he can get the full truth, outside forces intervene. Charlie is attacked and sent plummeting away, while Bison calmly reveals the real lesson behind it all. Corruption runs deeper than Charlie realized. The people above him, the very system he thought he could trust, had already been compromised. That's what makes Charlie's story so tragic. His final battle with Bison is not just about beating the villain. It's about uncovering the truth. And in Alpha 2, Charlie learns that Bison's power is not only in his fists or psycho power, but in his influence. He can buy people, manipulate institutions, and make even a decorated soldier like Charlie disappear. Now we have someone from Final Fight in Rolento. Like I said, I'm still learning more about Final Fight as well, so let's take a closer look at him. Based on his bio, Rolento is a former military commando who believes society can only survive through discipline, order, and overwhelming strength. He trains his soldiers mercilessly because in his mind, war leaves no room for hesitation. You either survive and win, or you're defeated. Unlike many characters who fight for personal revenge, Rolento believes he's working towards something larger. He wants to build a powerful military nation where everyone follows a strict code and where weakness is removed completely. That idea also shows how dangerous he is. Rolento may claim he wants to protect people, but his version of protection comes through control. He does not want to inspire others. He wants to command them. His final opponent is Guy, which connects directly back to Final Fight. The two men already come from the same world, but they represent different ideas of strength. Guy believes in discipline, tradition, and personal growth, while Rolento believes discipline should be forced onto everyone through military power. After defeating Guy, Rolento decides that the time has come to put his plans into action. He declares that the country needs a stronger military and promises to turn ordinary citizens into soldiers. Then, the ending immediately shows how extreme he really is. A city official receives reports that Rolento is driving a tank through a business district and throwing the entire city into chaos. Rolento announces that politicians had failed and that he will rebuild the country himself, whether anyone agrees with him or not. This ending continues his role from Final Fight, but it also makes his motivation clear. Rolento does not see himself as a criminal or a villain. He believes he is the only person strong enough to fix society. The problem is that his perfect nation would be built through fear, destruction, and absolute obedience. Now we look at a character who's had a cliffhanger story from the first alpha, Rose. Once again, her final opponent is Bison, and their rivalry continues to battle between two opposing forces, soul power and psycho power. Based on her bio, Rose is a fortune teller from Italy who possesses the ability to sense the services in the future. Her soul power allows her to read people, create illusions, and confront supernatural threats that ordinary fighters may not even understand. Unlike most characters pursuing Bison, Rose is not motivated by revenge or personal glory. She fights because she believes it's in her destiny to stop him. Her bio shows her confronting criminals who threaten the peace of her city. Even when offered money or the opportunity to walk away, Rose refuses. She believes protecting others is part of the responsibility that comes with her power. That same responsibility is what continues to draw her towards Bison. Bison's psycho power represents darkness, domination, and destruction. Rose's soul power represents spiritual balance and the protection of life. Their rivalry is therefore much larger than normal martial arts competition. It's a supernatural conflict between two forces that appear directly connected to one another. This is also why Bison is once again her final opponent. After defeating him, Rose believes she has finally sealed away his psycho power forever. For a moment, she thinks the nightmare is over, but something still feels wrong. Rose uses her tarot cards, expecting them to confirm Bison's death. Instead, the cards reveal that he is somehow still alive. This completely shakes her confidence. She believes she had fulfilled her destiny and destroyed the source of the darkness she had been sensing. Instead, she learns that Bison's psycho power cannot be eliminated so easily. Her ending continues the cliffhanger from the first alpha by showing their connection is far deeper than she understands. Even when Rose defeats him physically and attempts to seal his power down spiritually, Bison still survives. That leaves Rose feeling powerless, perhaps for the first time. She has seen the future, confronted the darkness, and apparently won, yet the threat remains. Her story ends with the realization that the battle between soul power and psycho power is not finished yet. Now we go to the Muay Thai champion himself, Sagat. At this point in the series, Sagat's entire journey is still shaped by his loss to Ryu in the original Street Fighter. Based on his bio, Sagat was once again recognized as the Emperor of Muay Thai, but after Ryu defeated him and left the massive scar across his chest, news of Sagat's defeat spread around the world. For someone who had built his identity around being an unbeatable champion, that loss was devastating. Sagat returned to Thailand and trained relentlessly, not only to recover physically, but to rebuild himself as a fighter. He faced countless opponents and continued developing new techniques, but none of those victories could ease what happened against Ryu. That's why Ryu was once again his final opponent. This rivalry has become more than Sagat reclaiming a title. Ryu represents the one defeat Sagat cannot accept and the one fighter capable of forcing him to question everything he believed about strength. In his ending, Sagat finally defeats Ryu and initially declares himself as the champion once again. But the victory does not feel right. Sagat realizes that Ryu was distracted and not fighting with his full focus. Instead of feeling satisfied, Sagat sees the win as hollow. He did not defeat the same determined warrior who scarred him. He defeated someone whose mind was somewhere else. This is an important moment for Sagat's character. Earlier in the series, he may have accepted any opportunity for revenge. Here, he begins to understand that simply beating Ryu is not enough. He wants to defeat Ryu at his absolute best, because only then will the victory truly mean something. Bison attempts to pull Sagat back towards Shadulo and encourages him to pursue greater power through psycho power, but Sagat rejects that path and leaves to train alone. He knows he needs to become stronger, but wants to find that strength on his own. So while his rivalry with Ryu continues, Sagat begins to change. Revenge still drives him, but honor slowly becomes more important than anger. His story is no longer about taking back the title of champion. It's about becoming strong enough to earn it. Now we look at the big bad for most of the series, M. Bison. For the record, this character is known as Vega in Japan. When Street Fighter 2 came overseas, Capcom rotated the names of the three bosses because a boxer originally named M. Bison looked a little too much like Mike Tyson. Vega became Bison, Balrog became Vega, and M. Bison became Balrog. Since this is the name most of us know him by in the United States, I will continue calling him Bison throughout the video. Based on his bio, Bison has been conducting experiments to increase the strength of his psycho power. He builds that power by absorbing the anger and hatred and suffering of others. Many of the people used in these experiments either die or are completely broken in the process, showing that Bison views human beings as nothing more than human tools. Unlike most characters in the game, Bison is not searching for answers, revenge, or personal growth. He wants complete domination. His only goal is to increase his power until no one in the world can oppose him. When he hears that Ryu has defeated one of Shadulo's strongest fighters, Bison immediately becomes interested in him. That's why Ryu is his final opponent. Bison recognizes the enormous potential inside Ryu, especially the darker power connected to his Satsui no Hado. He does not simply want to defeat Ryu, he wants to corrupt him, control him, and turn that power into another weapon for him. After defeating Ryu, Bison offers him the chance to achieve ultimate strength. He promises that the two of them could become invincible if Ryu accepts his power. When Ryu resists, Bison forces an enormous amount of psycho power into his body. Ryu is overwhelmed by pain, but his mind continues to fight back. Even Bison scientists are shocked by how long he survives the experiment. The ending leaves us with another major cliffhanger. Will Ryu's willpower allow him to resist Bison's control, or will the dark energy already inside him finally awaken? This ending shows why Bison is such a dangerous villain. He does not only want to defeat powerful fighters, he wants to break their identities, weaponize their abilities, and force them to serve his vision of absolute control. Now we're going to look at the wrestler himself, Zangief. Since we last saw him in Street Fighter 2, Alpha gives us more context behind the strength and national pride that define his character. Based on his bio, Zangief was naturally powerful from childhood and eventually became one of the most famous professional wrestlers in the world. However, simply defeating other wrestlers with his power driver was no longer enough for him. Zangief wanted to discover the ultimate form of combat. He studied different martial arts training methods and constantly pushing his body beyond its limits. This eventually led to the creation of his most powerful wrestling technique, the Final Atomic Buster. Unlike many characters in the game, Zangief is not motivated by revenge or a personal feud. He fights to prove the strength of professional wrestling and represent his homeland. His final opponent is Ken, and their confrontation has a much lighter tone than many of the rival battles we've already covered. Ken insults Zangief by calling him a mama's boy, but Zangief takes the challenge seriously because Ken represents another respected martial artist standing between him and his goal. After defeating Ken, Zangief proudly declares that his victory demonstrates the true power of Mother Russia. His accomplishments attract the attention of government officials who tell him that he now carries an even greater responsibility. They want him to travel the world and prove that Russia's strength is unbeatable. Zangief completely embraces the mission. He returns to training, continuing to wrestle bears and strengthen his body, despite the government admitting that its budget for supporting him is limited. As a reward, they promise to send him a bottle of their finest vodka. This ending captures what makes Zangief such an entertaining character. He's loud, patriotic, and completely devoted to becoming stronger, but his ambition is not malicious. He genuinely believes every victory brings honor to his country and proves the value of wrestling. For Zangief, defeating Ken is not the end of his journey. It's simply another opportunity to train harder, grow stronger, and show the rest of the world the power of the Red Cyclone. Now we look into the newest addition into the series, Sakura. Unlike most of the fighters we cover, Sakura is not entering the tournament because of revenge, duty, or a desire for world champion. She is simply a high school student who became fascinated with street fighting after learning about Ryu. Based on her bio, she is introduced to the fighting world by her classmate and best friend. From there, she becomes completely inspired by the legendary fighter known as Ryu and begins training herself by studying and imitating his techniques, even in her fighting style. The important thing is that Sakura has no formal master. Her Hadouken, Shoryuken, and Hurricane Kick are imperfect recreations of Ryu's moves, developed through observation, determination, and pure experimentation. She may lack experience, but she's willing to challenge almost anyone who looks strong because she believes every fight can teach her something new. That's why Ryu is her final opponent. She spent her entire journey trying to find him, hoping he will recognize her potential and accept her as his student. After finally defeating him, she immediately asks Ryu to teach her everything he knows. But sadly, he refuses. He explains that he's still learning himself and does not believe he is ready to become anyone's master. Instead, he tells Sakura that she must continue following her own path. Before leaving, Ryu gives her a photograph so he will have something to remember their encounter by. At first, Sakura believes he had gone easy on her, but she thinks about his words. She realizes that fighting is not simply about copying someone else's techniques or chasing victory for fun. Ryu's refusal does not discourage her. It gives her an even greater reason to continue training. Her friend jokes that Ryu may become her master one day, causing Sakura to immediately chase after him and nearly forget that she still has school to attend. Sakura's story brings a much lighter energy to Alpha 2, but it also introduces an important idea. She represents the next generation of fighters. See what I did there? Inspired by legends who came before them. She begins by trying to become exactly like Ryu, but her real journey will be discovering what kind of fighter she wants to become on her own. The last character to speak on in this game is none other than Saddam, continuing his rivalry with my guy, Guy. If you recall, Saddam originally came from Final Fight as a member of the Mad Gear gang. When he crossed over into the Alpha series, his main goal became rebuilding the organization after its defeat. Looking at his bio, Saddam sees himself as a warrior guided by honor, even though his understanding of Japanese culture and the samurai lifestyle is often completely misguided. He wants to follow his own version of Bushido, prove his strength, and restore everything he believes was taken from him. That's why Guy is once again his final opponent. Their rivalry connects directly back to Final Fight. Guy helped destroy Mad Gear, while Saddam is now trying to rebuild it. To Saddam, defeating Guy means overcoming one of the men responsible for his organization's downfall. After winning their battle, Saddam begins reconstructing Mad Gear and travels to Japan in search of powerful new recruits. He arrives at the sumo tournament and immediately becomes convinced that sumo wrestlers are exactly what the organization needs. Seeing their size and strength, he believes Mad Gear will become unstoppable if he can convince them to join. Of course, Saddam does not approach this like a normal recruiter. He interrupts the tournament, declares that he is only interested in the strongest fighters, and challenges one of the wrestlers directly. The ending closes with the two charging towards each other as Saddam continues his bizarre mission to rebuild Mad Gear with an army of sumo wrestlers. This continues the more comedic side of Saddam's character. He treats himself like a serious samurai warrior and criminal mastermind, but his plans are usually built around a confused interpretation of Japanese culture. Even so, his determination cannot be questioned. Like most fighting games from this era, Alpha 2 did not remain exclusive to the arcades for long. Capcom brought the game to several home platforms, but depending on which version you played, the experience could be noticeably different. For this video, I primarily played the original PlayStation release. It's a good version of the game and was probably how many players first experienced Alpha 2 at home, but I must say, it was not the only option, and it was not necessarily the most accurate one either. The original arcade release remains the baseline, running on a Capcom CPS2 hardware. This is a version every home conversion was attempting to recreate. It has the original animation, the visual effects, music, stage detail, and gameplay timing without the compromises caused by limited console memory. So whenever we compare the PlayStation, Saturn, or Super Nintendo versions, the arcade game is the standard they're being measured by. The PlayStation port is the version I spend most of my time with for this retrospective. Content-wise, it gives players important parts of the experience, arcade versus and training modes, the full central roster, character endings, and the major gameplay systems that define Alpha 2. It also features arranged music, giving the soundtrack a slightly different presentation from the arcade release. But I must admit, the PlayStation's limited memory created some noticeable compromises. Certain characters lost animation frames, meaning some moves and attacks did not appear quite as smooth as they did in the arcade. The game also uses a pre-recorded video for its introduction rather than recreating the sequence directly with the game engine. Then, once again, just like the last alpha, we have the load times. The load times are not completely unbearable, but they're definitely noticeable, even in today. When moving between fights, you'll be met with this long loading screen. When you're playing through multiple arcade runs to see every ending, those pauses in the loading screens begin to add up. The original PlayStation release also lacks some of the hidden character variations available in other versions. Moving on, we have the Sega Saturn version, which is generally viewed as the strongest of the original 32-bit console ports. The Saturn was especially capable when handling two-dimensional sprite-based games, allowing this version to preserve more of the arcade's animation than the PlayStation release. It is not completely one-to-one to the original arcade, but the characters generally move smoothly and have fewer frames to be removed. Loading is actually quicker, which helps the matches flow more naturally. The Saturn contains, as I said, Evil Ryu, EX Zangief, and EX Dazen, giving it more playable content than the original PlayStation port. It also includes an exclusive survival mode and an art gallery featuring illustrations from the game. Both the PlayStation and Saturn releases use these arranged soundtracks, although the Saturn's version audio presentation is often considered stronger. For anyone looking for the best original home console conversion of the standard version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, the Saturn port is probably the strongest choice. Moving along, we have the most surprising port of them all, the Super Nintendo version. By 1996, the Super Nintendo was already aging, and Street Fighter Alpha 2 had been designed for a much more powerful arcade hardware. Somehow, Capcom still attempted to squeeze the game onto a cartridge. The port used the SDD1 chip to decompress graphics and other data while the game was running. From a technical perspective, the fact that Alpha 2 functions on the Super Nintendo at all is quite impressive, but that achievement came with major compromises. The characters and backgrounds contain less detail, animation is heavily reduced, the image quality is rougher, and the sound is significantly compressed. The most infamous problem is the pause before each round when the cartridge decompresses and loads the required information. Despite being a cartridge game, players can be left waiting several seconds before the fight even begins. The main roster is still represented, but many of the additional features and hidden variations found in the 32-bit versions were absent. The Super Nintendo release is therefore less of an ideal way to play Alpha 2 and more of a technical curiosity. It proves how far developers could push the hardware, but it is also the most compromised version of the game. A Windows version was released, bringing Street Fighter Alpha 2 to personal computers. It offered another way to experience the game outside the arcade, but it never became as widely remembered or celebrated as the Saturn or the PlayStation versions. PC compatibility, controller setups, and differences between hardware configurations meant that the experience could vary more than it did on dedicated consoles. It remains an interesting part of gaming history, but when people debate the classic home versions of Alpha 2, that conversation usually centers on the Saturn and the PlayStation releases. The history becomes slightly more complicated because Capcom later revised the arcade game itself. In Japan, Asia, and parts of South America, Capcom released an updated version called Street Fighter 02 Alpha. This was not simply a direct port. It included balancing changes, altered custom combo mechanics, additional moves, and more character variations. This version expanded upon the original game and became the foundation for later home console release known as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. Now, this version was included as part of the Street Fighter collection for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Its name changed depending on the region. In Japan, it was called Street Fighter 02 Dash, while Europe received it as Street Fighter Alpha 2. Gold is based on the updated 02 Alpha arcade version and includes many of its balancing and gameplay changes. It also expands the playable lineup with Evil Ryu, EX-style versions of characters, and a hidden version of Cammy based on her appearance in X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Video coming soon. For casual players, this makes Gold feel like the most complete traditional home version of the game. However, more content does not always mean better competitive balance. Changes to the custom combo system remove some techniques associated with the original game's competitive scene. The revision also introduced new balance issues of its own, meaning some competitive players continue preferring the original Alpha 2 instead. So Gold is not necessarily a replacement of the original. It's better viewed as an alternate revision with one extra character and features, but also different balancing. Now we move on to 2006 when Capcom released Street Fighter Alpha Anthology for the PlayStation 2. This is one of the most comprehensive collections for anyone in the Alpha series. It includes the arcade-based versions of the 3 main Alpha games along with Alpha 2 Gold and additional unlockable variations. Because the releases were based more closely on the arcade, players can experience Alpha 2 without many of the memory and animation compromises found in the original PlayStation port. The collection also allows players to experience both the original version and the revised Gold release in one package, making it one of the best historical ways to compare them. And then we have Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Edition. For modern platforms, Street Fighter Alpha 2 is also included in the 30th Anniversary Collection. This collection contains 12 arcade versions from across the franchise, including Street Fighter Alpha 2. The most important thing to understand, though, is that this is the arcade version. It does not include the console-exclusive modes, arranged soundtracks, or expanded content from Alpha 2 Gold. Instead, it preserves the original arcade release through emulation. That makes it one of the most convenient modern ways to play an authentic version of the game, especially if you do not own the original hardware. So you may ask yourself, so which version is the best? For the most authentic original experience, the arcade release, or the arcade version included in the modern collection, is the strongest choice. For the best early home conversion, the Sega Saturn version provides smoother animation, quicker loading times, and more bonus content than the original PlayStation release. For the largest classic home console selection, Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold is probably the most complete package. The PlayStation version remains a respectable port and was perfectly capable of introducing players to the game, but its animation cuts, loading times, missing hidden characters prevent it from being the definitive release. And then you have the Super Nintendo version, which is best appreciated for what it managed to accomplish rather than how accurately it reproduced the game. Regardless of where you play it, the number of ports and revisions show how important Street Fighter Alpha 2 had become. The first Alpha may have started as an experiment, but by the time its sequel reached arcades, consoles, computers, and later compilations, Capcom had created another Street Fighter game worth preserving. When Street Fighter Alpha 2 was released in 1996, it received the kind of response Capcom was hoping for. The first Street Fighter Alpha had been successful, but it was also viewed as a smaller and somewhat incomplete beginning for a new branch of the franchise. With its expanded roster, redesigned combo system, detailed stages, and stronger presentation, Alpha 2 was widely seen as the game that fully realized the potential of the Alpha series. Critics especially praised Capcom for listening to the complaints surrounding the first game. The removal of the universal chain combo system was generally viewed as an improvement because it reduced the effectiveness of repetitive attack patterns. In its place, the custom combo system gave experienced players a mechanic that rewarded practice, timing, and creativity. Reviewers also praised a larger selection of characters, smoother animation, and more distinctive backgrounds. Even as the three-dimensional fighting games were becoming increasingly popular, many critics believe Alpha 2 demonstrated that a traditional two-dimensional fighter could still compete with or even surpass the newer polygonal games appearing in arcades and consoles. The arcade version received some of the strongest praise. Maximum awarded the game a perfect 5 out of 5 and called it Capcom's best fighting game up to that point. Next Generation was more reserved, awarding it 3 out of 5, but still praised its roster, its animation, character designs, and the complexity introduced by custom combos. Its reviewer essentially argued that while casual observers might dismiss it as another two-dimensional fighting game, dedicated fighting game players would recognize how much depth Capcom had added. But most importantly, players were showing up. In Japan, Street Fighter 02 became the country's highest-grossing arcade game of '96, according to Gamist. It also led Game Machine's arcade rankings during April of that year, showing that Street Fighter could still dominate arcades during that era, filled with major competition from franchises such as Virtua Fighter, Tekken, and even the King of Fighters. It's important because Alpha 2 arrived during a transitional period for fighting games. 3D fighters were becoming more of the industry's biggest attractions. Games like Virtua Fighter 2 and Tekken 2 were using polygonal graphics to represent what many viewed as the future of the genre. Instead of chasing that trend, Capcom doubled down on hand-drawn sprites, colorful anime-inspired artwork, and traditional two-dimensional combat. And would you look at it? It worked. Rather than making the game feel outdated, the visual style helped Alpha 2 stand apart. Its animation, expressive, character detail stages proved that sprite-based fighting games still had plenty of life left in them. And of course, the game's success was also reflected through the number of awards it received. At the 10th Annual Gamist Awards, Street Fighter 02 was voted the best game of 1996 and the best fighting game. It also placed 9th for graphics and 6th for direction and 4th for its music. Several individual characters also performed strongly in the magazine's popularity rankings. Dan Hibiki was voted the most popular character of 1996, while Sakura placed 3rd. Other fighters from the game, including Ryu, Zangief, Guy, Chun-Li, Akuma, Relento, and Kim, also appeared among the top 10 characters that year. Dan winning the character award is especially fitting. He became Capcom's joke aimed at SNK, but somehow became one of the most beloved characters in the entire release. Electronic Gaming Monthly named Alpha 2 its arcade game of the year. The Saturn version was also the runner-up for both the Saturn Game of the Year and the Fighting Game of the Year. Game fans selected it as Fighting Game of the Year and placed it as its runner-up for its coin-op game that year. So this was not simply a game that reviewed well. It became one of the defining games of 1996. The PlayStation and Sega Saturn versions were also received positively. Critics praised both ports for bringing most of the arcade experience into the homes. The roster, the gameplay systems, and presentation all remained intact, and both versions were viewed as a strong alternative for players who no longer regularly visited an arcade. The PlayStation version generally received scores in the 7 to 8 range. GameSpot awarded it a 7.8 out of 10. While IGN gave it an 8.5. The Saturn version received even stronger reviews. Its score on game rankings reached approximately 87%, compared with the roughly 82% for the PlayStation port. The Sega Saturn magazine awarded it 95%, while Mean Machine Sega gave it a 94%. That preference makes sense based on the differences we discussed in the port section. Both versions were good, but the Saturn preserved more animation and included additional content. Electronic Gaming Monthly selected the Saturn release as one of the games of the month, sharing its recognition with the PlayStation version of Tomb Raider. The magazine later ranked the Saturn port as the 36th best console-selling game of all time, specifically favoring because of its visual advantages. The Saturn version was also commercially successful in Japan, where it reportedly sold more than 400,000 copies. This does not mean the PlayStation release was considered bad. The PlayStation was simply not as well equipped for Capcom's sprite-heavy fighting games. Players still received an enjoyable version of Alpha 2, but the missing animation frames and longer loading times made the Saturn conversion feel closer to the arcade original. The one version that struggled critically was the Super Nintendo port. From a technical perspective, fitting Alpha 2 on a 16-bit cartridge was an impressive accomplishment. But reviewers also felt that Capcom had pushed the aging hardware a little too far. The graphics lost detail, animation frames were heavily reduced, and the sound quality was criticized for being decompressed and distorted. The game also suffered from slowdown during certain attack stages. Then there was an infamous pause at the beginning of every round. Despite running from a cartridge, the game temporarily freezes while its compressed data is repaired. That interruption damaged the pacing of a fighting game built around fast movement and immediate reactions. The review scores reflected these compromises. The SNES version averaged around 73% on game rankings, which was noticeably lower than the PlayStation and Saturn ports. Electronic Gaming Monthly's individual reviewers gave it a scores from 4 to 6.5 out of 10, while Famitsu reviewers scored it between 5 and 7. Some reviewers went as far as calling it the weakest Street Fighter game released for the Super Nintendo. But take note, not everyone dismissed it completely. Several critics acknowledged that players without access to PlayStation, Saturn, or arcade cabinets could still enjoy the core fighting system. In later years, the port gained recognition as technical curiosity because of how much Capcom managed to squeeze on the hardware. IGN even placed it at number 96 on its list of 100 greatest SNES games, acknowledging both its compromises and the ambition behind the conversion. So the SNES version was not celebrated for being the best way to play Alpha 2. It was remembered because it existed at all. So overall, Alpha 2 was a major critical and commercial success. It became Japan's highest grossing arcade game in '96, won several major industry awards, and received strong reviews across its arcade, PlayStation, and Saturn releases. Its redesigned combat addressed many of the criticisms aimed at the original Alpha, while its expanded roster and presentation made the sequel feel far more complete. Most importantly, the game proved that Capcom did not need to keep living entirely inside the shadow of Street Fighter II. The Alpha series could establish its own visual identity, its own timeline, its own approach to fighting game mechanics. It could introduce characters like Sakura, develop forgotten fighters like Gin, expand the stories of Ryu, Sagat, and Bison, and still compete against the growing wave of 3D fighting games. The first Alpha was an experiment. The second Alpha was the proof that that experiment worked. Now, when it comes to Street Fighter Alpha 2, I like this game a little more than the first one. And that says something because I genuinely enjoyed playing that game and learning more about the lore. I recently even bought a Street Fighter encyclopedia because I wanted to make sure my research becomes more accurate as we move deeper into the series. Games like Alpha and Alpha 2 are exactly why I want to learn more about this world. I want to know the who, the what, the when, the why, the where, and how behind every character and conflict. The only major issue I have with this game is how difficult it can be to actually find that story. When I covered Mortal Kombat, the manuals gave us character biographies, and some of the loading screens provided additional details about the world. Even when the story was not presented through full cutscenes, the information was still available somewhere inside the game or its packaging. With Alpha 2, most of that context is missing from the disc and its packaging. You receive the character endings, but not always the build-up explaining why these fighters are traveling the world or why certain rivalries matter. Unless you own the publication like All About Street Fighter 02, much of that information remained hidden from players outside of Japan. And even finding the magazine, you still have to translate each biography and page if you don't understand Japanese. I also discovered that a similar publication existed for the first Alpha, which honestly made me a little disappointed. Had I known about it earlier, I probably could have added even more context to that retrospective. I do not like that so much of the story feels like a secret or another challenge the player has to overcome. As someone who enjoys narrative and character development, I should not have to search through old Japanese publications to understand why everyone is fighting. However, when we judge Alpha 2 strictly as a fighting game, it is difficult not to appreciate what Capcom accomplished. The game is fun, easy on the eyes, enjoyable whether you're playing through the arcade mode alone or sitting in a living room fighting against a friend or a family member. Removing the universal chain combo system made the combat feel more deliberate, while custom combos gave players more freedom to experiment. The roster feels larger and more complete. The stages have more personality, and the overall presentation feels like a major step forward from the first alpha. That has really been the story of Street Fighter so far. Since the original game in '87, every major entry attempted to build upon what came before it. The first Street Fighter created the foundation. Street Fighter II transformed that foundation into a worldwide phenomenon. The first Alpha became Capcom's experimental playground, and Alpha 2 took those experiments and refined them into something far more complete. I saw the comments under my previous videos and noticed how many of you were looking forward to this one. Now that I have finally played it, researched it, and experienced the stories for myself, I understand why you were waiting for this video. Alpha 2 is fun, visually appealing, and one of the strongest games we have covered on the franchise so far. So what can I say? This game is a thumbs up for me. If you made it to the end of this video, first, I want to say thank you. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and hype it up, as it goes a long way towards helping smaller channels like mine in the YouTube algorithm. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, because the Street Fighter Takeover is far from over. We're continuing our journey through the franchise as we move closer and closer to 10,000 subscribers. And I would love for you to be a part of that history. We now have less than 500 subscribers to go. Now, next time, Street Fighter is crossing into an entirely different universe. The World Warriors will come face to face with mutants, superheroes, and some of the most recognizable characters in comic book history, as next week we dive into X-Men versus Street Fighter. So, I hope to see you there. And of course, if you're feeling generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. Link is in the description. With that said, this is the Retro Phantom, signing out.